Hey guys, it's Kier, and in this episode we'll be talking about the Pentool. And the Pentool is a very cool method to create our own custom shapes using paths. So over here, we can go to Essentials, we can reset Essentials, just so we're on the exact same user interface. I'm going to hide libraries, and I'm going to go to Layers, and I'm going to make this slightly larger. This file is available to download if you want to follow along as homework. And we're just going to be recreating some of these shapes using the pen tool. So we can get to the pen tool by clicking and holding on this little option right here, on this little pen, and just selecting the pen tool. So from here, we're going to start off with a very basic shape. We're just going to try to recreate the square. So the way the pen tool works is that we set anchor points. It's like little anchors, like you could imagine, that hold different curves in between those certain points. And those curves can be just straight lines, or they can actually have bends and fluctuations in them. In this case, when we're creating a square, we don't really want to have any fluctuations, we just want straight lines. And if we just go on the very points of the square, we can click once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and finish the shape by starting off where we ended. And there we go, we just created a square. But in this case, we don't have any properties applied to it, we just have a blue stroke. So I'm just gonna deselect and go to my regular selection tool, click it once, and I'm just gonna flip the stroke to the fill. And there we go. We just created a square. Pretty cool. So we see that we created the square only using 4 points, and that's pretty much how you're gonna be using the pen tool. You're gonna wanna create as little anchors as possible, and then just connect them using curves or just straight lines. So in this case, we used 4, which is great, because we're not trying to go above and beyond. Because we could have, in theory, changed this to 8 anchor points. We could have 1 in between on each segment right here. But that would end up being very useless because those points wouldn't have any purpose. They would just be on the same line as the straight line that we already created. And we're trying to avoid any complications when we're using the pen tool, just because if we want to go back and edit something, the less anchor points, the more control we would have with each individual anchor point. And you'll see this in use when we start actually developing this core letter type. So let's go on to the next example. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to Command C and Command V the square, and I'm just going to pop it over here, just so it's on top of the shape that we're trying to recreate. So with the pen tool, once we actually create these anchor points, we can actually modify them at any point using this direct selection tool. So we can actually go over to each anchor point, click and hold, and actually modify the shape of this. And we can stretch it out, really skew it, and we can create some funky shapes like this. So in this case, we're just going to go back to the original square. And I'm going to click and hold this corner while holding shift, and it's going to drag on a 45-degree angle, and we can drag it out. And then we can click command and we can shrink this down. And within a matter of seconds, we just recreated this arrow shape. You would often see this on the Apple iOS icons for the location. And again, we created all of this using the pen tool. It's quick and very easy to modify. So now let's do the exact same thing to create this little bubbly square. So I'm going to copy the shape again that we created, the square. And I'm going to try to recreate this bubbly effect just by modifying one of the anchor points that we already have. So I'm not going to try to recreate or add any new anchor points. I'm just going to try to take what we already have and just modify it. In this case, we have a really cool tool called the anchor point tool. And what this does, it converts your linear anchor point to something that has more curvature. So we can click and hold. We can actually drag out a curve from this anchor point. So I can make it a bit larger, a bit smaller. So I'm just going to try to mimic it somewhere around here. Looks pretty cool. Let go. And we just created a curvature from this small little anchor point. I'm just going to shrink this down. And there we go. We just instantly created a brand new shape just by modifying one of the existing anchor points. So one more thing to keep in mind, we actually have 2 more options right above the anchor point tool. And that's the add anchor point tool and the delete anchor point tool. And it does exactly what you would imagine. So if we add an anchor point, we can, let's say, go back to the square, we can add an anchor point. And then that just adds another anchor point on one of the existing paths that we already created. And we can click and hold and modify it however we want. Pretty cool. But in some cases, you might actually want to even remove an anchor point in order to create a different shape. And again, it works the exact same way. We can select the remove anchor point tool. And then let's say we want to remove this anchor point. Well, if we remove this anchor point, it's just going to remove it entirely from this shape. So it's going to try to reconnect this anchor point all the way to this anchor point. Let's try how that would look. We're just going to remove it. And there we go. So it still retains that line, but just because we actually take this anchor point that exists over here and we shrink it down to the center, we don't even see any fill here anymore, just because the lines are going on top of each other. And we basically created a fairly messy triangle. And if you ever get scenarios like this, you would also want to clean it up, just because there is no point having a line here if there's going to be no fill. So I'm just going to remove this line, and there we go. We just created a triangle out of a square just by removing 2 anchor points. And the same process can pretty much work for any shape that you create, any custom shape. You can add anchor points, remove anchor points, create curvature from them, and just modify them until you get a shape that you want. Because it's much easier and more reliable to create a shape using this method than trying to, let's say, Pentool every single little change in curvature that you have on a line. Because you can imagine that going on this shape and trying to recreate the curvature is going to be a bit more harder, and you wouldn't have as much accuracy as you would have just by modifying one of the anchor points. So let's go to the very top and let's see if we can create this core type. So I'm going to be doing the exact same thing. So I'm going to try to recreate this R first, and then we'll move on to the other letters. So I created a very nice, easy demo sheet for you to follow along with. The blue circles indicate that's where the anchor point should go. And it indicates the minimum amount that you need to create this typeface, or in this case, just to create the R. The green symbolizes the actual handle that we would have on the anchor point, and those handles just determine the curvature, or how far along the line should continue before starting to bend a little bit. And if we have one on one side, then we want the other side to be linear. So let's see how this works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pen tool the very inside. So I'm going to click here once, make another anchor point, make another anchor point, and then from here it's going to start to get a little bit tricky. So we're going to add an anchor point here, but we're not going to remove. We're going to click and hold, and while holding shift, we're just going to click and hold out a handle. And in this case, the handle indicates that it should only be around this far out. So we're just going to repeat that. So I'm just going to let go at around here. But then we see that on this actual anchor point, we don't actually get a full bend. It kind of cuts itself short. So we're going to go on the direct selection tool, click on this anchor point. We're going to want to create some more curvature. So we're going to click on the anchor point tool, click and hold. And we're going to click and hold out a line that follows this path as closely as possible. So I'm going to stop right around here. Go back to my direct selection tool, and we're going to take this line, the other path that we created, the other handle, and just drag it to the center. That way we don't have any curvature on that line. It's just flat and very linear. So now let's go back to the anchor point tool, the pen tool. We're going to click on the pen tool, the very last anchor that we created, and I'm going to continue drawing out my line. I'm going to click here once, and the little green line will actually show that on that same vertical line, that's where the other anchor point is located. So we know that they're accurately on top of each other. So I'm going to click, hold, and press shift to get a straight line. And then I'm going to go back to my direct selection tool, take this handle, and drag it all the way to the center. Then with a pen tool again, we're going to click it once and finish this entire shape that we created. But we still have some flaws in the shape, so I'm going to click and hold on this anchor. I'm going to drag this out just a little bit, just so it connects evenly. And then we're going to do the exact same thing on the other anchor point, just with the anchor point tool to modify the curvature. So I'm just going to drag out some fairly ugly lines, and with the direct selection tool, we can just minimize the actual shape. And I'm going to try to follow the diagram as close as possible. And this should work. And there we go. We just created our first custom shape. And now with the direct selection tool, we can modify on one of these anchor points at any time. But if we go with the indirect selection tool, we actually take control of this entire shape, and we can move it around however we want. So now let's actually go back to the larger shape and try to pen tool that out. But it's going to be much easier just because we have more linear surfaces. So with a pen tool, I'm just going to click once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and I'm going to hold shift while I'm doing this just so I get a straight edge, 90 degrees right here. Going to do it once more, continue doing this, and we're going to get to a tricky part once again. So I'm just going to click and hold to grab some curvature. I'm going to click and hold again to continue the curvature, and I'm going to finish off the rectangle. So now we created 2 custom shapes within this same area. But you see that this new path that we created is on top of the existing path that we created, and we don't even see what we're going to be changing. So in this case, I'm just going to dim the opacity, and now we can actually see the before and after. So we see what we should be cutting out. So I'm just going to grab both with the indirect selection tool. I'm going to go to Window, Pathfinder, and I know that I want to cut these 2 shapes out. Increase the opacity back to 100%, and I'm going to divide them. Now we can actually click on the divided path and delete it. And we have a perfect R. And the same method applies to anything that you really just want a pen tool. It's a very easy way to create our own shapes. And we'll talk about how we can actually use the pen tool in conjunction with other shapes in the next lesson. But for now, we just want to somewhat define how these shapes are going to look just with the pen tool. So I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other letters. And you see that with the E, we actually come across the problem where, again, we don't see where the next actual anchor point should be placed. So I'm going to go back to the indirect selection tool, and I'm just going to dim the opacity. That way I see what's underneath the shape that we're creating. Another method of actually, I'm just going to hold shift. Another method of actually coming across that problem is that instead of actually having a fill show up, we can just have a stroke show up. We can go back to the indirect selection tool, really bump up the weight, go back to the pen tool and finish off the shape. And now once we're done, we can actually just flip it back to the stroke and increase it to 100%. And there we go. We have our next letter that we just created. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for the C and the O. So in this example, I'm just going to start off with the corner shape over here. And I'm going to dig down. I'm going to click and hold, drag out that curvature. With the direct selection tool, just increase this line, back to the pen tool. I'm going to click on the next anchor point, modify to where the diagram says to stop. Go back to the anchor point tool, give this some more curvature. So 1 and 2. We actually have to do the exact same thing for this path as well, because our little anchor point disappeared. We're going to click and hold while holding shift again, or while holding alt. We're going to take this anchor point and we're going to point it to a different direction. So in this case, we want to point it to this anchor point. Back with the pen tool, I'm just going to continue with this line. I'm going to click and hold. And I'm going to click and hold. I'm going to hold alt and point this path, and we're going to point it to this anchor point. we came across the same problem as before, so I'm just going to dim the opacity, just so we see what we're changing. I'm going to go back really quickly and just adjust the curvature. Perfect. Back with the pen tool, I'm going to continue clicking on this line and continue pen tooling this. So now that we came across the O, you'd actually notice that pen tooling this might give us some inaccuracies just because the paths or the actual handles on the left hand side might vary by just a little bit than the right hand side. So in this case, we would actually want to use shapes in order to recreate this letter O, because the shape that we create would actually give us the exact measurements and it would be even throughout. While with the pen tool, creating some of these shapes might just give us some flaws and it might just be a nightmare to fix. But if you do on a pen tool, the exact same principles would apply. You'd click, hold, drag, adjust the handle, click, hold, drag, adjust the handle. And that's pretty much all there is to the pen tool. You're just defining anchor points and then you're defining the curvature that goes in between. That's pretty much it. So I'll see you in the next lesson where we can actually tackle this core logo just by using shapes. So I'll see you there.